work on grasslands. He'll become probably a circuit pastor of some sort. I wanted to knock him a little bit off step here today. Story about that. You know, when one day in a cold winter day, a pastor went to church and he opened the doors, only one person showed up. And he preached to this individual obviously needs to hear what I have to say. So he talked and he talked and he talked and he talked. And after he finished, the rancher came up to him. He said, "You know, that was really good, Pastor." He said, "But if I go out to feed the cows and only one shows up, I don't give them the whole load." You've got a full group of people here, so you can dump the whole load on us today, Dirac. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, really excited to be here. I did bring slides, so, you know, whether it was a panel or not, I'm coming with slides. Yeah, thanks, and we'll see how much I get this right. But no, it's great to be here. Thanks, David and Dan, for the invite. I always really excited to come down to Kansas. Kansas as a state and the grasslands of the state is why I'm in this profession and field. I was born in Nebraska, but grew up from 5 years old until I went off to college at grad school in Missouri. And my dad and I would come back all the time, pheasant hunting in the state. I know all the back roads of the state, as far west as you go, because we were out every weekend. We knew it was good for our mental health, so that's why we did it. But that's at least what we told my mom. I also got engaged to my wife about a block away. She went to Wichita State for her master's and is a PA. So, you know, there's just a lot of great memories of this state. And, you know, when we started getting certain data and seeing the scope of the challenge ahead of us for grasslands, Kansas was one of the places, not just because of my history, but just knowing enough of the people and so forth here, where you're like, where is there going to be an opportunity to show how to build it and to show and demonstrate that we can have success at scale? In grasslands, that's one of the things we're missing. And we're really good ecologists talking about the mechanisms of things, talking about then what we're generally losing. Ecologists are really well known in terms of, like, we're really good Chicken Littles about how the sky is falling, right? Like, man, we do a good job of that. We don't do as good of a job of showing how to build things and showing how to demonstrate success at scale. And that's partially because in grasslands it's so privately dominated in our part of the world. And we haven't figured out how to demonstrate that well with these kind of partnerships. So these types of meetings are going to be key if we're going to actually sustain success. And I'm going to paint a little bit of a picture at the request of David here of just where we've been and where we're going. And 5 to 7 years ago, we just didn't see the problems the right way. We didn't see the scope the right way. We didn't understand really what we're up against. We're all in denial on some of these issues. And so it's the strategy, the strategic support, the policy, how we funded things. There was just parts of our business model that were the strongest part. It was our strategy, how we could scale up our collaboration space that maybe was weaker. As we've gotten better at those things, our business model is something that's becoming increasingly important that we need to match the scale of collaborations we're starting to see on the ground. So I'm going to talk about that in these rooms going forward. This is a picture of the Flint Hills. This is the kind of thing you see online all the time, but I bring this up because I'm fortunate enough to see a lot of landscapes of grasslands, and we're losing our horizons. And that seemed to really resonate with certain areas of Kansas and certain other places. Like, where do you have uninterrupted horizons of grassland? And around the world, that's something that we're seeing slowly disappear in different locations, are those horizons. Like, the walls are caving in, and you start looking at old photos, you're like, man, look at those horizons that really had that prairie grandeur associated with them and the sense of scale that maybe we've taken for granted. And we want to keep some of those and keep some of that scale. So this is stuff that there's this number of publications for several decades going back on this. This is one quote I pulled out that's actually from an international grassland conservation group for grasslands. But this quote of temperate grasslands are the most misunderstood and most underfunded ecosystem on the planet. Of all the major vegetation types, this is the one that's most understood, most underappreciated, most underfunded. And so it might not be a surprise then that we're seeing some of the challenges we're seeing play out. Our understanding and how we identify with grasslands is a challenge. So this is something my kids, we're gonna go see my in-laws here in a week. They give my kids every Christmas like this Kids Weekly, the Week Junior magazine, real popular one, goes out throughout the entire country, huge youth readership. And it was a month ago where they're like, oh, Dad, check it out, the site of the week. And it was the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas. And they're like, check out the bison. And of course, what do you think of when you think of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve of the week? You think of that picture on the left, right? That's what Tallgrass Prairie looks like to everybody in the world. Like, prairies have trees in them is the picture that we've painted forever. Now that doesn't mean, right, that there wasn't patches of trees, right, prairie and groves, that kind of thing in aspects of prairies. Or you had this prairie matrix, and those were the outliers. It just means like this is literally how we paint this. If you search up Google for different ecoregions of Kansas, you find pictures of trees in all of our prairies at scale. You don't see those prairie horizons anymore that dominated historical photos. So we have this lack of identity, visibility. We have a lack of a sense of appreciation of what grasslands look like at scale and how they contribute to human well-being. And this was brought up earlier. What's being played out now? Like that's going back on that. That's where we've been, right here. This lack of identity and appreciation for grasslands. So we had to start communicating grasslands where it started connecting to scale. So we started talking about grassland biomes and understanding like they're part of one of the world's major vegetation types, like tropical rainforests. We have a biome week in Nebraska that kids learn about. We talk about tropical rainforests, not our grasslands. So understanding the scale of biomes and what that means was important. We're trying to write that connectivity and what that meant for how we've built our infrastructure in it. And instead of having a pheasants movement or NRCS's soil or a water district's water or Kansas Livestock Association's beef, all the commodities of grassland that everybody has a job for, we forgot to say, wait a minute, our grasslands, the ecosystem is important. We needed that umbrella. Almost all major conservation movements going back in history are tied to the ecosystem and geography of place. Great Plains grasslands. So that's why you started to see this pop up. It was not by accident. It was to give us a sense of place, identity, and geography. And we started to see that with like Central Grassland Roadmap, the NRCS's first biome conservation framework. What is it that landowner groups start to identify with? Like, right? It's the Flint Hills, it's the Gypsum Hills, it's the Smoky Hills, and those prairies that are embedded within those geographies. That's the kind of style that we should be copying. This is unprecedented to where people are rallying around grasslands and not just what we care about the grasslands provide. We need that. That's really led to, and this is where we were, like as grasslands have lost more than any other major biome on the planet, how do we actually move forward? So there's this desperate plea for a call to conserve our last bigger grasslands and to get ahead of these problems. And so we actually did a paper where we looked at what was the connectivity and just amount of area remaining of the world's temperate grasslands, and really this call to action we see globally. And so when you're looking at this, those four right there are the most intact remaining grasslands in North America. You have the Nebraska Sandhills. It's actually the most intact temperate grassland in the world. Nobody in Nebraska knew that. It was just a system that was there. We celebrate Halsey National Forest, where we first did afforestation with cedar trees, more than the Sandhills ecosystem. We just didn't know. You look at the old 90s posters. When I first started coming over, think about the Flint Hills. There was a celebration of the last tallgrass prairie region. And you see less of that today, that classic celebration, right? We kind of talk about what every rancher's doing or, you know, the amount of fire in the Flint Hills, the critique of the Flint Hills, but we forgot to maybe celebrate the last tallgrass prairie region, the most intact temperate grassland. Like, then you have this short grass prairies. So those three right here, and then here is the southern grasslands. That's the other portion of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. These are our biggest chance to contribute to large-scale global grassland conservation efforts. 5 of the most 10 converted grasslands in the world are in the United States. So we don't do a good job of conserving grasslands at scale. And we take for granted what it's going to take. And scientists from the Southern Great Plains have been like, you better have your eye on woody encroachment because it's coming central and northern Great Plains. Well, we haven't had that problem yet. Well, yeah, it's for the next generation. And so just understanding, like, how do we not have this right here? I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I live in one of the most converted ecosystems in the world. That comes with a series of consequences, right? That we know about with that scale of row crop agricultural production, with things like water quality, pollution, the lack of, right, there's a bunch of hedging of different biodiversity loss that we have. And so the sense of scale is important. All right, but that's where we were, this call to action and plea. Once we started getting better data, we could actually track what the top drivers of grassland loss are. It's something like 86% of the United States is either already converted, experiencing early signs of woody encroachment, or is at risk of those two drivers, 86% of this map here. Now, what's interesting is that the northern half of the Great Plains especially, we know the history of land use conversion. That was our historical driver of grassland loss, and that was done for a real or perceived economic benefit. That was the main driver. What's interesting today is that woody encroachment, right, like we make this decision, it happens now. Woody encroachment is now displacing grasslands at the same rate as land use conversion. So every year we lose as much to land use conversion for row crop agriculture as we do to now woody encroachment. That was a shocker for the northern half of the Great Plains. We show this map because here's everywhere that has low to no cultivation risk, the green. Everywhere green in the southern Great Plains over time, you see, right? Look on that map on the right. You see that it's red. That's where we have cover of woody plants. So if you escape the tractor, you don't escape the trees. What's going to be next century's biggest issue, or as we go forward these decades? Row crop agriculture took the primary land use already. So as this continues to spread, all these areas of green, it's like how vulnerable and how much do we expect those to actually have increases in woody plants? A place like the Flint Hills, right, where we burn on average about 2 million acres a year, we should be good with woody encroachment given the historical connotations of that it should keep us under wraps. But we're seeing where that's not enough as the squeeze comes in and you're surrounded by that pressure. So this is why we talk so much about these two dominant drivers. So to answer David's question of where have we been, here's our mantra for the history of grassland conservation. And think about this, right? We are losing grasslands more than any other of the major vegetation types on the planet, which means that that's our legacy, is those consequences that come with that. It's like engineers going, yeah, we built these bridges, but man, they fail quick, right? Like society tends to judge our profession of like, we gave you all this money, there's more money coming to grasslands, continue to lose. What'd you do with it? What were the outcomes? What were the benefits of actually those investments? And so what we did in the past is we had land use conversion and woodland expansion. What do? We restore what we lost. And that's where most of the money went to, overwhelmingly, right? And so we replant prairies here, where especially in areas where there was marginal crops, et cetera, go back to prairie. Or you have this level of woody encroachment, and then we decide to act and we move it back. But that's not really what happens, is it? When we've tracked this over time, we're stuck in perpetual cycles of that mantra. So what happens? Talking with FSA, which we have a 5-year project with them on across the Great Plains, it's their least durable program within the Conservation Reserve Program. So almost half gets plowed back again. And then what do? Oh, we're gonna restore it again, right? Like, so what is that? That's the business model. We're all just doing our jobs. But the business model of conservation incentivizes this perpetual cycle. What happens with woody plants? And I rudely was eavesdropping last night. And somebody goes, oh yeah, we finally got after that and cut all those cedar trees in this area of central eastern Kansas. And now 1 million of them are coming back. Yeah, we have all that data. What happens? Oh, we go out there and we cut it. But then millions of them are coming back. And just so you know, we've already published this kind of work. It comes back faster the second round and comes back faster. So the speed of the re-encroachment or re-invasion process increases. And that means that the lifespan of the treatments aren't what we thought they were. And getting back what you lost is harder. It's less economical. So if you don't have this problem, great, we don't want you to because it's such a problem from the economics, which we've actually started to track and look at. So we want to get out of these perpetual cycles. There's not a successful paradigm in the world that would be caught in this kind of trap. We want to escape this trap. So that's what I'm going to hit on more. Like, that's the old mantra. That old mantra didn't matter as much when we had local issues. But when you're talking about biomes and you're talking about large-scale grasslands, it becomes important. So this is what a lot of people usually rush out and start drinking in the morning. My apologies that they have us at this time period, is seeing this information and data. Like, once we had this, and what you're seeing on this graphic is this, everywhere sea green, this is our historical ancient grassland biome. We learn about this stuff in high school, right? There's the biosphere and then biomes. And then eventually you get down into like, right, communities, populations, organismal, individuals, that kind of thing. This is our ancient historical forested biome that of course stretches east. So they're separated by a boundary where one biome stops, another one begins. And they ebb and flow a little bit over the course of history, but this has largely been stable, even with all of our land use conversions since the last ice age. Now this is 1990, so I was 10 when this played out. And over the course of 30 years, our biome is moving. So just look at that trajectory over the course of 30 years. So it's not that biomes have collapsed and transitioned and reorganized throughout the history of the world, but we don't expect it at this rate. And we don't expect it at this kind of scale this quickly. Here's the Black Hills. The Flint Hills starts to look more like the Black Hills with where we are today. Landowners, when we were first meeting with them in the Flint Hills, were like, it was almost this coming together discussion in an early meeting of where it's like, oh yeah, I'm just having to spray or work harder managing woody plants than I used to. And somebody else is like, oh yeah, me too. The fire's not being enough, even at the rate that we're burning in a lot of areas in the Flint Hills. You look at this, like the Flint Hills is now embedded within more of a forested biome. It's the wrong side of that boundary today. It's one thing when you're over here in the sand hills, right? They're just now going to get pressured like they've never before. So it's like, well, we don't have a woody encroachment problem here. We can take care of it. As the squeeze comes in, woody encroachment reveals every weakness of our management paradigm. So the areas of the draws that we're not burning or we're not managing or the fence lines or anything else, it takes advantage of every square inch, and then it puts increasing pressure, which makes it higher maintenance. And boy, Black Friday is coming. And my wife, every year for Black Friday, because she always forgets, I guarantee this coming, goes, I got some great deals this year. I am so low maintenance. And because she's not here, I can say this. And I'm like, yes, you are, because I'm not 10 anymore, and I'm smart enough to say that. And then under my breath, I go, but not as low maintenance as you used to be. That's our grasslands. They're higher maintenance. It's becoming higher cost to maintain them. And it's because we're surrounded by pressures and the things that cause degradation of that ecosystem. That's important to understand. If that's what happens when you're embedded in an alternative biome state or surrounded by those kind of pressures. And so what we've done is work all over through this to try and figure out, like, how do we navigate this kind of scale of collapse? Now realize brush management is one of the most expensive things that was done in the Farm Bill. Pulled this from NRCS a few years ago. So $177 million in the Farm Bill spent on brush management. Where do we spend that money? And I'll show you a graphic because we got better data later on this. But we tend to spend that money, right, chasing the problem, that old mantra. And then we wait and we don't get ahead of this issue over here. We don't tend to manage at that level and scale. And so we've just chased the problem. We've got to get out of that old mantra of waiting to act. Here's that data that we then got that shows this. So the right practice, the right place, the right time. So what you're seeing on that graphic on the right, here's the biome boundary today, that black line and where it moved. So where do we tend to put our practices? So the ultimate range improvement practice is a windbreak. We put it in our intact rangelands more than any other improvement practice. And of course, right, it provides wind protection in places that lack tree cover and that are wide open prairies. So this is like, it's like 97 to 98% occur within the intact biome area. This is 1.14 million NRCS practices that were derived from this to show it. And this is just tied to the general guidance of what we do. So there's your hotspot map. We put it in the Dakotas and Nebraska, of course. And here's where we put brush management. So that's the legacy of the grassland technical guidance and science and extension, right? Like, we plant trees and then generations later we're like, oh, well, we have to do brush management. why don't we have as many windbreaks put down here anymore? We used to put them down there. And because I get bored and I tell bad dad jokes, that's because Oklahoma and Texas don't need to break as much wind as they used to. That's the best laugh I've gotten on that joke. I usually tell that joke for that one person that David talked about. But yeah, so that's the deal, right? Like, it's tree saturated more in those landscapes because of woody encroachment that happened. And we just want a better plan, right? There's nothing wrong with these practices. We just don't have a sustainable strategy to conserve this ecosystem. We need to be able to plan around practices. So if you walk through this, that's the ultimate improvement practice in rangelands. Then what do? We plant fences, we plant water, right? We do prescribed grazing. That's what we do in our intact grasslands, the good old days of range. And then what we do is we say, man, we're losing stuff. We better get to restoration. So we do brush management and prescribed fire and fire breaks. And then eventually you forget all that and you say, you know what? We're going to do forest stand improvement or tree shrub maintenance. You manage for your new normal, right? You even forgot that these areas used to be grasslands in future generations. We redefine it. What's missing? There is no practice that is widely incentivized and that we actually implement, and all this comes back again, like this funnels back to what we do in the university system too, that can prevent woody encroachment at scale. All of the thing, right? What was the ultimate improvement practice pre-Euro-American settlement? Indigenous groups burned, right? Like, grasslands are something to be nurtured, so dusty, what do you feed them? Fire, right? Like, that's what we did in grasslands. That enhance the resilience of these systems where woody encroachment, right, things like Eastern Red Cedar, one of the most fire-sensitive plants in the Great Plains, was restricted as a local tree source. So we took that management tool, that feedback, went from an improvement practice and we turned it into a restoration one. And we said in the science that fire could be replaced, if you look back in the old literature, with some other tool. We didn't replace that tool within our intact rangelands. We view it only as restoration. So we're doing nothing to enhance the resilience of our grasslands to woody encroachment. Of course, this is then what's going to play out at scale. And of course, like, there used to be this deal where there was a line in the sand where woody encroachment couldn't go further west. We've studied that, we've published that. That's not true. We have woody encroachment happening in Wyoming, in the western area of the Great Plains, in Montana in the western area of the Great Plains, up into Canada, the northern area of the Great Plains. We know that that line in the sand is now not correct. We just didn't have exposure to the seed sources that we do today, and it takes a long time for this kind of things to manifest. So this is what our legacy is in terms of cartoon land. So this is then what Nebraska Cattlemen put together several years ago when we first started showing some data and didn't have these maps and everything we have now. So I think this is just their depiction of what we were starting to understand and present. So what do? It's like, and I just love the tone of the graphics here. You know, I sure am thankful for the cost share. Couldn't be more in love and proud at this moment, and couldn't be more cursing, you know, dad, grandpa, or the same person, or the neighbor, right? Like, as this plays out. Nothing wrong with the practices. We don't have a good plan to meet our ultimate goal. I get asked all the time, what are the benefits of our practices? And it's like, to me, asking, what's the benefit of a hammer? That's not really the goal of what we're trying to achieve and why we have our jobs. How are grasslands performing? What is that land use providing? Right? How important is that ecosystem to the state of Kansas? Like, these are just tools that we use, and if they don't come together as part of a plan or a strategy, it's like asking that engineer, hey, what's the benefit of that tool? Well, I can build a bridge, I just don't know how, but thanks for giving me all the money to do it. We gotta have a better plan on this stuff going forward. And we funded people to deliver practices. We didn't fund people to develop a plan. So the business model, right, and the strategies. Now, when you get biome level collapse and biome level transitions, you get biome level consequences. So it's not just like Jim's cows on his ranch. People are like, but that doesn't affect me in Wichita, Lincoln, Omaha. And you absolutely bet it does. When you have large scale systems collapsing and transitioning, it starts to show what we took for granted of those systems and the connectivity that they offered. So yeah, we see 75% collapse of livestock production when you go from a grassland to an Eastern Red Cedar dominated woodland. 75% in every state with long-term data on that. But it's not just, right? It's not just if you care about livestock production. Things like the American burying beetle, threatened endangered species that rely on grasslands in certain areas, right? Those crash when we go from a grassland-dominated habitat to a woody-dominated habitat. Pollinators that require grasslands as part of their life cycle. Grassland plant diversity, or if you care about things like big game like pronghorn, or mule deer, things like that that actually start to abandon sites with early signs of woody encroachment, especially with things like cedar. Or the greater prairie chicken, the only prairie chicken not to make its way onto the endangered species list so far, and that the stronghold in the sandhills now, the biome's on the front door, right? So what does that lead to? Increased regulation, which we've avoided largely across some of our grassland areas. Or it's increases, if it's not this traditional livestock wildlife side, other additional research showing increase in tick-based vectors, or West Nile virus being higher in Eastern Red Cedar woodlands than in deciduous forests or grasslands. If it's not that, it's all the discussion about water and the complex aspects of what's changing in water dynamics across our system. If it's not that, it's increases in wildfire danger. And 10 years ago, I used to be talking about how Texas and Oklahoma would be the next Rockies, the next California. And I stopped saying that over 10 years ago when I was down in Texas because it was there in 2011, 2012. And I said Kansas will be the next Texas and Oklahoma and Nebraska. And that's now here. And why is it here? We have a volatile fuel source widely expanding across our areas because we have some practices for a benefit that plant things like cedar and other practices that remove it, but without a sustainable plan where we can actually prevent this from really taking off. So we have volatile fuels spreading, which is like 1940s, 1950s, Western wildfire 101. And we can't get ahead of it. Why? Because we chase the problem. We try and get back what we lost because we're really good in crisis mode. Or it's things like even school funding, where we have 1 million acres of grazing lease land in places like Nebraska, where all the revenue goes to fund public education, which means that goes to kids funding in Omaha, Lincoln, Kearney, Grand Island, true ecosystem services coming from rangelands. It affects every citizen in our states. That's why grasslands are important. And that's what we're losing as we're losing these biomes. Now, we didn't have the kind of data to play the big game, and we do now, and so I'm going to hit on this a little bit, but we know how much grass we now produce and how much we've lost to woody encroachment in our rangelands. Walking through this, when I first came to Nebraska, they're like, we don't have a cedar problem in Nebraska, and this was November 2013, so I'm in my 11th year there, and I was like, well, that sounds like an interesting hypothesis. I think I'll test that. I was more snarky back then than I am now. So South Dakota, we should have already been working in South Dakota. So from 1990, as woody plants increased, and we can model this, they lost 145,000 tons in South Dakota. You can see the counties of where you see a reduction in yield. In agriculture, we call that a yield gap. What do we want to do in all of agriculture? We spend billions of dollars in research and technology on this, prevent yield gaps. What do we do in rangelands? Wait till you lose it. Then we'll try and get it back when it's more expensive. No other sector of agriculture has that kind of technical guidance. We try and prevent losses in yield. Let's do that, right? Which, by the way, scientists forever have said we'll never do because we just can't get past that denial on how we like to do the good old days of range. 145,000 tons. Every year we'll lose a little bit more. Nebraska used to look like South Dakota, 420,000 tons. Kansas used to look like Nebraska, 2 million tons. Oklahoma used to look like Kansas, 4.5 million tons. All of this depends on how much rainfall these years, right, of what's grown and what woody plants take out. But as woody plants continue to march, it takes land out of agricultural production. It takes land out of wildlife habitat and wildlife production. That's what woody encroachment does that's different from, say, land use conversion. Now, people don't know what those amount of things mean. So, there's one way that I like to show it. Shelley Kelly goes, show it in round bales. What's 420,000 tons mean? I could leave Lincoln, drive on I-80 to North Platte, go up to Valentine, Nebraska, and back, and see nothing but round bales, making that the most boring interstate and highway drive ever. Nothing but round bales for 10 and a half hours. So multiply that by 4 or 5, and that's what we have for Kansas, and that's where Nebraska's going. Is just this is that kind of legacy, and it matters, right? It matters to feedlot operations, matters to our beef supply chain, matters to wildlife and all those other ecosystem services I hit on earlier. Now, it's not just there. Like we were looking at some of our data and we looked at Wyoming, and let's look at the place that is one of the most intact grassland regions of the world, eastern Wyoming. And sure enough, we see some blimps on the radar screen of like, it looks like some wood encroachment happening, but I've published that plenty. And it's like, what kind of wildlife data might somebody have there? Oh, pronghorn or sage grouse. So sure enough, Jeff Beck had pronghorn data. And long story short, Tori Donovan from my lab, who's now a professor at University of Florida, she analyzed that data. This is the mecca for some of pronghorn big game migrations out there and just pronghorn abundance. Here's all the herd units for pronghorn that are red that have negative outcomes associated with tree cover. Very early signs of increases in tree cover really impacts pronghorn in terms of their recruitment. Not affecting their population abundances yet, but it's affecting fawn-doe ratios and recruitment. So, right, like they're barely having it yet. Well, we've had meetings now with Wyoming where they're having statewide discussions because this is big money. And it's not just that, right? It's also tied to livestock, and they've heard this story. Can we get ahead of this in some of the areas? Well, if Wyoming's moving, why isn't western Nebraska moving? Or western Kansas, right? Like, they're not further ahead than us. It's just getting past in all these areas the fact that if you haven't lived through this yet, nobody tends to act early enough. That's been our history. That's been the legacy of what we've known and studied on this so far. And so that's been part of the challenge. Can we get ahead of it? So where do we usually work? Where should we work? Here's a graphic of this. As you get more and more abundance of any invasive species, the costs go up, the consequences go up, and we tend to react to those in general. Why do we wait until we're surrounded by the threat to work here? Why aren't we working in these landscapes, right? Like if you're surrounded by cheatgrass or old world bluestem or sericea, you're going to perpetually be in high maintenance mode to manage old world bluestem, cheatgrass, or sericea, or eastern red cedar and woody plants. Oh my gosh, why aren't we striking as early as possible and removing the risk? This is literally across rangelands of the West what we did not do. That's where we got to move and change. So I bring this up to be like, what best describes this landscape? And I do this from the perspective of a grassland. So here's a sandhills grassland. There's a real picture, real example. Which of the following best describes this landscape? So show of hands in the crowd. Who thinks this picture shows a mostly intact grassland landscape? I won't truly judge you because I'm off the clock as a professor up here. But show of hands, mostly intact. Who thinks mostly contaminated from the perspective of grassland? What about like mostly infested? Yeah, I mean, there's just a couple trees out there, right? Like, so, man, there's a couple people that raise their hands, which shows people are tired of dealing with woody plants in some areas. Nobody in their right mind when we first showed this would have said anything except mostly intact. But 95% of recruitment occurs within 2 football fields of a seed source. So if you don't see the problem, right? Like, I don't see the problem in my garage as things are stacking up and my wife parks there and I don't. She sees the problem and is like, would you get this stuff out of my garage? As trees are coming in and everything else, we're not seeing the problem, right? Like, what's in all this area that makes it yellow? Seed. So what happens if you do a brush management now, right? Just going out there and clipping them off. You're like, cool, took care of that. There are babies in waiting everywhere in that landscape. So what happens next? More of them. And what happens next? Even more, right? The number of recruits, the number of trees increase over time, which is why that stuff didn't work. We've got to hit them before they reach sexual maturity, which on average for cedars is like 6 foot tall tree. And we should be preventing that from becoming this kind of scenario. Real example. What about this one? Mostly contaminated. Oh, we're already disgusted in the front. I told you people would run out for morning drinking. I'm sorry. That's how this works. Mostly contaminated. Who thinks mostly infested? Who thinks a mix? And again, there's the perspective from a grassland, right? It's that mix, right? You have established sexually mature trees and you have all the interspaces where there's seedlings and seeds hiding in that herbaceous layer that we don't see. Why do I show both these examples? Because these examples did not qualify for cost share. That's a picture from Oklahoma. That's not 10% cover. That's what it required to qualify for cost share. So we're gonna have reductions in yield. Chickens aren't there now, right? That's the kind of legacy of this. Like, there's nothing preventative about what we used to do. So how we used to see it, this is from Doug Spencer at Gypsum Hills Workshop. Look at everybody pointing down the horizon as you start to see what's coming and the pressure in these landscapes. Here's where you had tree cover. Now you start to understand where there will be future tree cover because of all the seed and seedlings that you can't see because we're not ants crawling around in the grassland. We just aren't detecting them, seeing them. And our practices that we applied didn't necessarily manage that. That's why fire did something that no other management technique did. It could kill mature trees. It could displace entire stands of things, of conifer stands like cedar under the right conditions. It can kill seedlings and it consumes seed. No other management technique does all that at once. So if you're gonna replace that, you better bring the Swiss Army knife and your friends, right? Which is fine, but it's just harder than you think when we're talking about trying to prevent these types of changes. The mantra today is prevent large-scale grassland loss. And just adding this into what we do. So our profession, we're professional ambulance drivers. There's a crisis, we are here to help, right? And that's what we did in rangelands. Well, I remember ranchers everywhere going like, why aren't we talking about what we want, which is the grassland? Why aren't we doing more preventative health care? Now, at my current age, I ignore my doctor in terms of exercise and eating right and everything else, because what do they know? Right, this is like medicine 101 or talking to your doctor. It's like, would you please take care of your rangeland or your health? All right, yeah, just there's certain things you want to avoid. Old world bluestem, cheatgrass, woody invasions. And we can just be smarter about some of those things, especially from the woody plant side, and add that into what we're doing. If we're gonna scale up and meet this though, and get to this new effort, I'm not gonna talk a lot about that. That's like that defend the core. I wanna talk about what it's actually gonna take. Like moving the needle, I was told a long time ago, it's impossible to get people to prevent these kind of changes. It's impossible to impact the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is set. It's impossible to have things tied to state government and have grasslands be recognized as that. Like all of this kind of stuff's impossible. It's like moving the Titanic while it's sinking is kind of how it gets communicated. It's gonna require us to band together at a much bigger picture. That's what happened after the Dust Bowl. Why? You're talking about large scale catastrophic events. And this is a deal from Jeff Nichols, who's retiring at the end of the month, of the grazing specialist up in Nebraska. The collapse of the grassland biomes of significant comparable reference to why things like conservation districts and the NRCS came to be. This is where our fields initially, land grant institutions, conservation districts, NRCS, we were designed because of this scale of problem. So when we're talking about the loss of grasslands at this scale, this is our responsibility in order to be able to navigate, mobilize, and make our jobs work better for us. And so that's why I moved. I play in these different spheres. I've done very basic resilience theory research. I spent more time in applied ecology, but there's this whole domain of user-inspired research. So if we're gonna try and navigate biome collapse, I needed to embed myself with landowners, with the partners that work with landowners, better understand that real world and not my ivory tower. It's not good enough to be an interdisciplinary professor across hydrology, range, fire, wildlife. We need to be able to better understand the gauntlet that landowners and you all face if we're gonna truly create solutions around it. And so that's called translational ecology or co-production or user-inspired science. And this is something that we don't have much funding for. Funding goes more to basic research than it does to user-inspired research. That's why you don't see scientists on your teams, because that's not where our funding and our business is. So we have to demonstrate success at scale, which means there's these principles associated with it: co-production of knowledge, engagement of diverse partnerships, long-term commitment, because you can't fix these things in a day, knowledge exchange and learning, where I learn more talking with landowners in these groups than when I'm outside of it. It helps build my ideas in science. And that there's co-ownership in the process, not just an external science critique, and also where it's not just like, oh, I'm just doing my job, we're doing these practices. There's co-ownerships in our grasslands being sustainable and providing the benefits that they're supposed to for society. And that leads also to decision framing context, where we're part of that as groups of teams. That's where I see a future of this going, but we have to demonstrate success of how to do it. And we reference that as the ultimate experiment. Can we show and demonstrate examples of how to successfully navigate a collapsing biome? That's like the Great Barrier Reef is collapsing with all the bleaching, tropical rainforest, you name it, all these big discussions. Can we successfully navigate that kind of collapse? Because no scientist in the world thinks you can. You're going to live with your new future, that is the literature. And we're not going to mobilize to actually have a chance. So the origin story on this is when I had that data, I talked with Shelley Kelly in the Sandhills. I'm like, I want to do what led to that. There's a dot right there that's a U.S. Forest Service site. Charles Bessey showed we could plant cedar trees and pine trees in the Sandhills of Nebraska, which was cool, right? Like, that was inhospitable to trees. So that's now a national forest. And I'm like, we need to do that for grasslands. Because if we get ahead of it out in front of this, we could show how easy this could have been compared to when you're chasing the tail and following the problem. She goes, how much area are you talking about? I go, I want 1 million acres. She goes, 1 million acres? I go, I want 100,000 acres, like the used car salesman that I was. I dropped my price 90%. She's like, ooh, that could be potentially like 3 to 5 landowners. I wanted one place. That was 5-6 years ago. But then as we started talking, it was amazing hearing landowners go, no, we want to do that here. We care about grasslands, and we can scale up as a community. So all of a sudden, that's what you're seeing on this map. This is a glimpse. This map now, what you're going to see from me in a year is what cultural will of grassland starts to look like. We have almost all federal agencies, a bunch of the NGO groups that have lands, private land collaborations and network, tribal, where groups are standing up saying grasslands are important, and they need to have better recognition and identity, and they're valued. And we need to demonstrate in a way that is customized to our place how to navigate things like woody encroachment and other drivers of grassland loss. I'm not saying what to do. They're the ones putting this idea on the ground with a better strategy. But if we're going to get there, we got to continue to improve our business model. So there's these things called the tech transfer proficiency pyramid. Everybody on here, this is like my vision of what I've learned being part of these user-inspired research groups, as you might call them from my end. So there's this tech transfer investment and how much the proficiency is needed, and it goes from low to high. So in here, right, like this might not look like you think, but everybody in here has that kind of connection. It's very important of why we were established originally and why it's important for this topic. So question on this becomes like, whose mission aligns most strongly with each demand? So who thinks that low tech transfer investment, low audience proficiency, this broad awareness, Kansas Department of Ag, Kansas Association of Conservation Districts, K-State, KGLC, I'm using the groups that are here as an example, but obviously it's much more. Who has the best opportunity to do that? That's Kansas Department of Ag. Not Kansas State, not University of Nebraska. This has connections to the governor's office, to the general public, and this is low investment. They don't have the capacity and capital of what we do in the universities. So I'm going to give an example of that. What about knowledge tied to general training or information synthesis? That's our universities, right? Because that amount of technical investment and what we try and achieve from audience proficiency goes up. Now, we might do more than this, right? I'm just generalizing here. What about the skills, where we start getting specialized hands-on skills? KGLC, right? We have these schools. I'll show an example from their website here in a second. And then place-based action, that is our local working groups. That's like these conservation districts and that type of tech transfer there. That's where you have really high investment. Do you think we're all on the same page? Boy, forestry did a great job of having everybody on the same page. Grasslands, we didn't build that umbrella for grasslands like that. We should learn from that example. But there's something missing here too. We don't have the information flow and funding flow for this to communicate as a system. We're just all doing our jobs, but it's not flowing correctly up and down the chain. So this is a little glimpse of what this starts to look like. I'm going to go pretty quick, and I'm going to use examples from all over. Here's Nebraska Department of Agriculture. And I asked ranchers, and I have a meeting December 6th with Nebraska Department of Ag to where we're bringing this up. And then you go to the table of contents. So as a rancher, do you see yourself in this? We have beef, pork, dairy, corn, soybeans, wheat, hay, and alfalfa. And then you get down there and it's like wine, grapes, Christmas trees, hemp, hops. Where are grasslands? Oh, we support a bunch of this stuff, but we don't get to be in it. So this is what it looks like for corn. There are 21,500 corn farmers. In 2019, 9.81 million acres, more than 1.79 billion bushels. How do we communicate grasslands? We grow 4,000 kilograms per hectare. We look at quadrats. We have this data now. So what do we want? Grasslands should be on the table of contents. And that's not just going to happen in Nebraska. That should happen in Kansas. That should happen in Oklahoma. And we'll tie it with the right color of our land grant institutions as part of our partnerships. But this is easy. We just got to provide the conduit and the pathway to get that information out. What does it look like for conservation districts? If you go to the website, we provide programs and initiatives, technical and financial assistance, right? Like that's what we do. And if you go on there, you can see threats. And you go to plants, and it's like, heck yeah, we do stuff like brush management. And you go to animals, it's like, heck yeah, we do stuff like planting shrubs and trees, because that's the ultimate improvement practice for animal wind protection. And so we do both those practices, because that's what we all do, and that's what has been part of our dynamic. But that doesn't define success, because we don't have a sustainable plan. What do I want to see us be able to do with conservation districts? And we talked about this in South Dakota really early on in the process. There is money in grasslands in the future, and we need conservation districts to be able to do conservation planning in grasslands, not just implement treatments. And we need to then funnel money like it should to where we actually have this tied to our local working groups. As we continue to lose grasslands, guess what's going to happen? Money for grasslands is going to increase. As we continue to build umbrellas of success, guess what's going to happen? Money for grasslands are going to increase. But you all have this tie of local working groups, identifying resource concerns. There's an opportunity to scale it up there and deliver this technical assistance and so forth, tied to these other partners. But we got to get to better planning, which same thing we talked about with NRCS and others, because brush management, when we've looked at that in the past and published on it, does not meet long-term sustainability of grasslands. It's very short-lived. Its performance is underwhelming. We've got to get to a better grassland performance here. So we want to get to a better strategy where we're anchored in tech grasslands and prevent that spread. That ought to be part of the business model that we fund conservation districts for. And we have people in here that fund conservation districts and where there's grants, right? Like to where we have the ability to do that. But that's not been part of our traditional business model. We've all been doing our jobs, but not part of that model. This is from Doug Spencer. He's like, after you read that pocket guide and think of a different strategy, you see this everywhere. Even Leonardo DiCaprio is like, look at the seedlings everywhere you look. You leave here, you'll see seedlings and that filling into your garage everywhere. But we need conservation districts and those local working groups and local landowner collaborations if we're going to change this history. There is no county that's prevented increases in woody plants and losses in production. And there's no county that's restored it after that started. There's only a couple things I guarantee. You will have drought, you will pay taxes, and you will lose production to woody encroachment over time. All right. And here's how I view KGLC. We need the conduits to flow. So KGLC has these range schools, prescribed burning, range and prairie management. So they call it like the refueling tanks, where you have like the state organizations like Kansas NRCS, Kansas Department of Ag. There needs to be a conduit to these local working groups to where information and funding can flow, and we can provide that feedback like we see with other sectors of ag, forestry, in grasslands. And so, I was kind enough to this refueling conduit. That's actually nobody's job right now. And it's critical missing gap. And so I'm calling on, there's certain groups that have the potential to serve that pipeline and serve as that conduit. And we got to make it part of their business model, or else everybody's just doing more work and is overworked. And the same is true from us as a science end. We can't just work in basic and applied ecology. We have to be part of the teams on the ground and open gates for each other. That's where we get better outcomes. When we've done that in areas, and we're building this with groups, a lot of landowners here know that now, we've shown the opposite of just dying slowly in the Chicken Little narrative. First evidence of halting large-scale transitions in grasslands anywhere in the world. less canyons in Nebraska. I expect to have that in Kansas, and we started that in January 2020 on stuff. Ecoregion scale increase in grassland bird richness. Increased population abundance of the American burying beetle, which was endangered when we started that project. That just got accepted. Increased plant diversity. Reduced wildfire danger. Restoration of grassland productivity and more money every year for ranchers that live in that area. This has been featured in National Geographic, Beef, New York Times, Fence Post. Those are the stories that we can build successful models after if we get this business model continuing to roll. And I expect to have these kind of science reports as we go forward in the state of Kansas. But make no doubt about it, like Kansas is the proving grounds. It's the state where this is going to happen next at scale, right? Like half of Kansas is already hit by the wrong side of the biome, and it's going to continue to expand. How big of grasslands are going to be left? What are future generations going to have in this system? And what legacy are we going to leave? Because there's no doubt society is going to judge us for the impacts and the benefits. And that'll be the question. It'll test our cultural will. It'll test our motivation, inspiration, and how important grasslands are to us. And we'll adapt. We're people, right? It's not the end of the world, but man, grasslands like tropical rainforests, that's a pure goal. Like there should be some places that still have them, whether it's in Kansas or Montana or Canada. That's part of our legacy, and that's part of our history. And this room plays such a critical role in that because it's so important to that business model. We need to do a better job of starting to think through how we can help with that from our end. All right, I'll end there. Thank you so much, David.